Having trouble setting up this phone. There we go. Here we are again in the car. I decided to do this in the car again because I've discovered that I like doing this in the car. So I told you in a couple of videos ago that I was going to talk about methodism, particularism, and skepticism. All three of these approaches to knowledge are an attempt to answer the problem of the criterion. You can Google the problem of the criterion if you want to read more about that. What I'm about to explain, I learned from J.P. Moreland. And if I get it wrong, don't blame J.P. for that. It's because blame me for it. So, okay. So, broadly speaking, the problem of the criterion is the problem of answering two questions. The first is, what do we know? What particular items of knowledge do we have? And the second question is, how do we know them? Or what counts as knowledge? Or what criteria must we fulfill before we can have knowledge? And the problem of the criterion is kind of a chicken and egg problem, because it seems like you can't answer the first question unless you have an answer to the second question. And you can't answer the second question unless you already have an answer to the first question. So the skeptics kind of get rid of the problem by saying, well, I guess we just don't know anything. There are different kinds of skepticism. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of skepticism. But the skepticism I'm talking about is just the skepticism that says we don't know anything, or it's impossible to have knowledge, or whatever. A Methodist answers it by saying, well, we have to have some criteria before we can know anything. And so we have to have a method or whatever by which we can know things. And then once we have that method or criteria, then we can start sorting things we know from things we don't know. A particularist begins with particular items of knowledge that it seems like they know. And then based on that, then they say, well, how do we know those things? And then based on that, on this question of how do we know those things, they can figure out a method. And from that method, learn new things. So I'm a particularist, and so is J.P. Moreland. And I'm going to explain why I'm a particularist, not necessarily why J.P. is a particularist. The claim that we don't know anything strikes me as being a self-refuting claim, because presumably this claim comes about through some line of reasoning. There's some reasons people give for why we don't have knowledge. One is that it's possible your senses are deceiving you. It's possible that the external world doesn't exist. If you've ever read Rene Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, he goes into all the reasons why it's possible to doubt things. So that's one reason. Another reason is because, when you look back in the past at how many times you've been wrong, how many times your memory failed you, or how many times your senses failed you, or whatever, even reason, sometimes you can do the best you can to reason inductively and logically and still make mistakes. And so skepticism can be arrived at just by the recognition of our own fallibility, things like that. But here's the problem I have with that. Any argument you give for the conclusion that we don't have any knowledge depends on premises. And if you don't know anything, then you can't know that any of those premises are true. And moreover, you can't know that your conclusion that we don't know anything follows from those premises. So it seems to me that before you can be rational or justified in doubting everything, you have to know something. You have to know that your senses have deceived you in the past, or your memory has failed you. You have to know that it's possible that you could be wrong, or something like that. So, and besides that, I don't think many of us are really skeptics anyway, or we're not global skeptics. Because all of us, if we're just totally honest with ourselves, will admit we know a few things. I know who my brother and sister are. I know where I live. I know that Whataburger makes hamburgers. And I know that for obvious reasons. I was just there. Speaking of which. Okay, so skepticism is a no-go for me. So let's look at Methodism. The Methodists say that before you can have a item of knowledge, you first have to have a criteria for what counts as knowledge. Well, there's a problem with that too. That leads to an infinite regress. Because let's say I want to figure out that I know something. Well, I have to know two things. Let's say the thing I'm trying to figure out whether it's an item of knowledge is P. We'll call that P. So before P can be an item of knowledge, I have to know two other things. I have to know what the criteria is, and I have to know that P meets that criteria. So that's two things I have to know before P can be an item of knowledge. But if I have to know something if I have to have this criteria before I can know something, then I also have to have a criteria for why this criteria counts as an item of knowledge. How do I know that this is the right criteria? And furthermore, how do I know that P meets this criteria? Well, now I've got to have another criteria, and I've got to know that this criteria meets that criteria. You know what I'm saying? It leads to an infinite regress. And so you can show that Methodism is self-refuting because it leads to this infinite regress that can't be resolved. Because if you have to know how you know something before you can know it, then you can just you can play this game with anybody who's a Methodist. They claim to know something based on some criteria. You can say, well, how do you know that criteria? And they'll have to give you some reason. Well, I know it because of such and such reason. And you can say, well, how do you know that? And then they'll have to give another reason. You can say, well, how do you know that? And you just keep doing this all day until they get tired. So Methodism is a no-go as well. Because Methodism is self-refuting because it claims that you have to know something that you can't know unless you perform an infinite regress. Well, if you're anything like me, you're a mortal. Not immortal, but a mortal. In other words, you haven't been around forever. And so there's no way that you could have ever completed a beginningless series of justifications for why you believe anything today. So that leaves us with particularism. Particularism is where you begin with what at least seem to you to be clear case items of knowledge. It seems clear to me that there's an iPhone in front of me. I exist. The external world exists. It's sunny outside today. I've got a brother and a sister. All kinds of things I can claim that it seems like I know. And based on starting with those what seem to be clear case items of knowledge, I can then figure out a method. I can do that by just thinking about these things that I know and saying, well, how do I know these things? And once I figure out how I know those things, then I can use that method to acquire more knowledge. And so basically, under particularism, your knowledge begins with clear case items of knowledge. It doesn't begin with a method or a criteria. It's the other way around. There's a lot of objections you can raise to particularism too. If you can just begin with clear case items of knowledge before being able to account for how you know them, well, it would seem like you could just arbitrarily claim to know anything. And if you're talking to a Christian apologist, it can seem like they're cheating. Like, what if I just said, well, it's a clear case item of knowledge that Christianity is true? Well, that seems like cheating. You claim anything. And I think there's some merit to that objection. Of course, somebody who claims to be a particularist can just arbitrarily claim to know anything. But there's two problems with that objection that I have. One is that if a person's being totally honest, they're not going to do that. They're not just going to claim to know any arbitrary thing and then just cry foul whenever you ask them how you know it. I had a second objection to that. I can't remember what it was, though. Oh, well, I wrote about this on my blog. I'll put a link in my blog to this. And also, if you want to read more detail about it, if you look at Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview by J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig, there's a whole section on epistemology. And there's several chapters, and one of the chapters, I think, deals with skepticism, and it deals with the problem of the criterion, and it talks about all this stuff. J.P. Moreland goes into a lot more detail about it than I'm going into in this video. But it seems to me that particularism is not only the correct approach, but it's the approach that almost all of us take. Because almost all of us, even if we claim to be total skeptics and claim we don't know anything, nevertheless still make claims about the world that we think are true and that we think we're justified in believing. And so, but if you question almost anybody about it, say, how do you know? How do you know? How do you know? After everything they say, eventually they'll go, I don't know. You know, you'll stump them at some point. Unless they've, really thought about epistemology and really got it worked out. Almost anybody can be stumped just by brainlessly asking, how do you know, after everything they say. So pretty much all of us are particularists in practice. That's how knowledge works. We begin with clear case items. Take the knowledge of the external world. Almost all of us just kind of automatically assume that the external world exists, that what you see is what you get. It isn't until we start thinking about philosophy, start reasoning like Rene Descartes, that we start questioning it. I think it's a mistake to jettison the whole existence of the external world or other minds or whatever, just because you can't put your finger on how it is these things. I think that, if you're just totally honest with yourself, you believe in the external world. Sure, there's some people out there that maybe legitimately think they're in the Matrix or something like that. But most of us probably don't. And so I think the correct view, or the view that we're all kind of forced into, is that we believe a lot of things, and we can't necessarily put our finger on why we believe them, but we should be honest with ourselves. I guess the other thing that I was going to say about particularism and the objection to particularism is the fact that being a particularist does not mean that you're infallible. So if a particularist claims that they have some clear case item of knowledge, say my knowledge that there's an iPhone in front of me, the fact that I could be wrong, for one, is not sufficient to say that I actually am wrong. And the other thing is that I could be wrong. It could be that if I begin with a certain clear case, what seems to be a clear case item of knowledge, it could be that it's not. And maybe by asking myself, how do I know that, and digging into that, I can discover that I actually don't know it. But I think that in most cases, if you're not talking about anything borderline or anything that's debatable or something like that, if you're just talking about, what I call common sense realism, we're probably all going to come to the same conclusions. There's a sun in the sky. There's a difference between night and day, things like that. I exist. You exist. I'm making sounds right now. There's just all kinds of things we know. We know that we have parents. We know that we're human beings. We know that birds are not human beings. There's just all kinds of things that, if you're just a reasonable person, that you will have to admit that you know. And so in the next video, I plan on delving more into the question of how we actually know things. And that's all I got for you today.